All right, welcome in everybody to Taking the Field, episode 11 now. This is the Premier Lacrosse League Collegiate Draft recap show from the draft last night, which took place on NBC Sports Networks. It was 2 rounds, 14 picks overall, each of the 7 clubs receiving 2 picks apiece, and the Archers, to no one's surprise, took Grant Ament, number 1 overall in the draft, with Brian Costabile going second to the Atlas, which was one of my favorite picks because the Atlas are my team. Then Michael Kraus, Tom Rigney, and Matt Gaudette rounded out the top 5. And if I do say so myself, I completely nailed the top 3 picks in the draft with Eamon Costabile and Michael Kraus going 1, 2, and 3 in my mock draft from yesterday's episode. So congratulations to me, I guess. But this show is going to be all about some of the takeaways that I got from last night's draft and the 14 players that were selected over the course of the hour. So one of the first things I got was the Chrome doubling up on defense with their 2 picks. So Chrome head coach Tim Sudan took Tom Rigney 4th overall and Reese Eddy with his 9th overall pick in yesterday's draft. And now the Chrome, according to the PLL website, have about 10 or 11 defensemen on their roster following the additions of Rigney and Eddy. So top returners for this team include John Madursky, Mike Manley, Alec Toulette, Ryan Flanagan, Joel White, and Brandon Mullins to that defensive unit. And the team also added Jesse Bernhardt on defense in the entry draft. And we'll talk more about the Chrome defense toward the end of this episode. Another takeaway that I got was the Atlas are now ridiculously deep at offensive mid by drafting Costabile with that 2nd overall pick. So the Atlas already had Paul Rabel, Joel Tinney, Connor Busick, John Crawley, and Romar Dennis, who they acquired in that trade from the Chrome, as their offensive mids, but Costabile just adds even more depth and ridiculously good shooting ability to that already solid midfield unit. So now what the Atlas are going to be able to do is they'll be able to utilize this depth in the midfield to spread around that 2-point arc and be able to space the field and space out the offense for some of their attackmen like Eric Loff working at X. But on the flip side for the Atlas, I'm not entirely sold on the pick of Aiden Hines, the defenseman they took with their 10th overall pick. So after they took Costabile number 2, and I talked about this in my mock draft yesterday, after they took Costabile number 2 overall in the draft, they did have to look at defense with that 10th pick, but I'm not really entirely sold on Aiden Hines as the pick here. The Atlas do have 7 pulls on their roster now with the addition of Hines, and they carried 6 for most of last season. So I would expect going into training camp this season before the championship series that there will be some sort of position battle or roster spot battle between Austin Pafani and Aiden Hines, because as I mentioned in my mock draft yesterday, the reason for taking a defenseman here, in my opinion, was the idea that I wasn't sold on the play of Austin Pafani last summer. So I would expect Pafani and Hines to be battling sort of for that 6th long pull spot on the roster. And after the draft was over, I went back and looked at some of the highlights from some of these guys that were selected that weren't in my mock draft. And one of them was Hines. And I found very few highlights of him from Yale, which I found kind of interesting. But one of the highlights I did find were some of the defensive possessions during that national championship game against Virginia. And in some of those highlights, Pafani kind of stood out to me, but in a way that, Hines stood out to me, but in a way that Pafani stood out to me last summer. And that's not necessarily in a good way. So there's kind of some sort of similarity there between kind of the lack of focus or attention to detail on the defensive end of the field by both Pafani and possibly even Hines. But like I said, I wasn't able to find too much on him, so maybe upon further review, I'll learn to like the pick a little more. But at least for right now, I'm not entirely sure I'm sold on that pick for the Atlas. So now we'll get into my draft winners and losers from last night. So a possible hot take here is my draft winner, which are the Archers. So they lost out on Pat Spencer last summer in the draft. And after trying a few guys at that X attack position last summer during the 2019 season, it seems like they finally were able to get that quarterback of their offense at X in this year's draft by selecting Grant Ament. And then in their second round pick, selecting Jack Rapine, the defenseman, he's a solid pickup here for Chris Bates after losing Jackson Place to a season-ending injury last season, and that was a brutal injury for him, so hopefully he ends up getting back onto the field hopefully soon, but I wouldn't expect to see him out there anytime this summer. But one thing that the Archers defense was actually very good at last season was creating lots of caused turnovers. They had 3 of the top 5 players in terms of caused turnovers last season in Scott Ratliff, Jackson Place, even though he got injured at the end of the season, and Matt McMahon. Ratliff was second in the league with 13, Place was fourth with 12, and McMahon was fifth with 10. And if you go back and look at the last full season of college lacrosse in 2019, Rapine finished the season with 13 caused turnovers in 16 games, which in the PLL would have made him tied for second with his now teammate Scott Ratliff with 13. So I really like the picks that the Archers made in last night's draft. And then an honorable mention draft winner, as I mentioned, I would come back to this, was the Chrome by selecting Tom Rigney and Reese Eddy to really bulk up that defense that was one of the worst in the league last season. So now, as I mentioned before, the Chrome now have about 10 or 11 polls on their roster, so they have more than enough defensemen than they really need going into this championship series season. But really what Tim Sudan has been able to do is create depth at a position where they weren't very good last year, and that gives him options going into training camp and even into the championship series in July to be able to build this defense the way that he wants it to look so that it can be improved over the version of themselves that they were a year ago. So even though he has all these defensemen now on his team, having those sort of options isn't necessarily such a bad thing. And then one notable individual pick that I really loved, and I talked about this one in my mock draft yesterday, was Peyton Smith, the faceoff specialist out of Marist, going to the Redwoods at number 6. Greg Gorenlian, even though he was banged up for most of the season in 2019 with knee and lower back injuries, just barely cracked the top 5 in faceoff win percentage last summer at around 50%. Whereas Smith in 2019 was able to finish the season with a 63% win percentage, which would have edged out Trevor Baptiste by tenths of a point for number 1 in the PLL in terms of face-off win percentage. So I think Smith from day 1 going into training camp with the Redwoods will be their number 1 face-off guy. And then my potential draft loser from the 2020 PLL Collegiate Draft is the Chaos. Not that I don't like the picks that they made, it's just I'm not sure really how much sense they make for the team. So first they selected Matt Gaudette in the first round, and I really like Gaudette as a player, don't get me wrong. I talked about him in my mock draft yesterday. I think he's a really solid player, but I'm just not sure how he'll fit into this Chaos offense. I think that's one of the things that Andy Towers now has to think about in terms of building this offense around guys like Connor Fields. Because Gaudette now teams up with Miles Thompson, who also likes playing around the crease like Gaudette does, so it kind of makes you wonder what the spacing will look like offensively around a guy like Connor Fields who works from X. But one of the things I'll say in defense of this pick in terms of having the two guys that like banging around the crease is that the Chaos do like running that 1-4-1 offense with Fields from behind. So what you could do is have Gaudette and Thompson in the middle, as I said, kind of banging bodies around the crease, getting those slam dunk goals. And then on the wings in that 1-4-1, you could have Josh Byrne on one side and Jake Fricaro on the other. And then your midfielder up top would be someone like Sergio Salcido, who they got back in the Miles Jones trade, or you could have Deemer Class or Kevin Buchanan or somebody like that. So that's something that they could look at this summer for the championship series as far as how they want to operate within their offense and putting certain guys in certain positions. And then in the second round, Andy Towers goes out and gets Jeff Teat, and we don't even know if he's going to be playing this summer or not. We don't know if he's going to go pro or go back to college for his final year of eligibility, much like most of some of the guys we thought we would see in this draft are deciding to do or not. So essentially, he could end up with only one pick in this draft, and I think in a draft where most teams like the Redwoods, the Chrome, and the Archers seemingly answered a lot of their questions, like the Redwoods with their face-off position, Archers getting the quarterback of their offense, or the Chrome readdressing their defense in the draft and kind of building up their defense the way that Tim Sudan wants it to look. When those teams kind of answered some of their roster questions, I feel like Andy Towers sort of created more questions than answers in this draft. So he kind of went about it in reverse, sort of, but I have to believe that for a team that went 7-3 a year ago in the regular season, they have to have a plan for why they chose the guy that they did. So I think we just have to wait and see what that plan is when they get into training camp and finally get on the field and start to figure those things out. But for right now, the chaos picks kind of seem a little bit questionable to me. So those are my winners and losers. Those are some of my key takeaways from this draft that occurred last night on NBC Sports. I really enjoyed watching it. I loved the picks for teams like the Archers and the Atlas and the Chrome. And I'm so excited for this championship series in July. I'm really excited about the idea of sports betting with this league. I think that will be huge and a huge development as far as growing its fan base and everything. So we'll just have to stay tuned with that in a few months when that gets underway. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field. Make sure to like, share, and comment on this post. Tell me what you liked or didn't like about last night's draft, what you're looking forward to with this summer's championship series, maybe even the sports betting, whatever it is. Let me know in the comments, and we'll get back to this soon. I'm not sure really when, but we'll try to get a few more episodes in here in the next few weeks or so. Until then, thanks for listening.